Well, hello there. It's episode 304 of the Keto Diet Podcast. And I'm really excited to share with you today all about heart disease, the function of the cardiovascular system, what eating keto does to it, and how we can heal and support our bodies. If you've been eating keto for a while, and this is a rather old thing, most people are down with the keto stuff, but if you have friends who are like, bah, you're going to have a heart attack by eating all that fat, today's episode is a good one. If you have questions about today's content, you can go to healthfulpursuit.com/contact and ask me. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Hussey, MSDC, who's a chiropractor and functional medicine practitioner. He attended both his doctorate of chiropractic and master's in human nutrition and functional medicine from the University of Western States in Portland, Oregon. He is a health coach, speaker, and the author of 2 books on health, including The Heart, Our Most Medically Misunderstood Organ. Dr. Hussey guides clients from around the world back to health by using the latest research and health-attaining strategies. In his downtime, he likes to be outdoors, playing sports, reading, writing, and spending time with his wife and their pets. Okay, let's cut over to today's episode. Hey, I'm Leanne Vogel. You're listening to the Keto Diet Podcast. I've created a free guide with tips on how to start keto and maintain your fat-fueled life. Grab it at healthfulpursuit.com/free as a little thank you for listening to the show.
My name is Dr. Stephen Hussey, and I am the heart coach at resourceforhealth.com. And I'm very excited to be on the Keto Diet Podcast today. And today, we're going to be talking mainly about heart health because that's my passion. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, and you'll see why that's my passion. But first of all, a little bit of my background. I'm a chiropractor, and I also have a master's degree in human nutrition and functional medicine. And my story is that I, from a very young age, I had a lot of chronic ailments and conditions. I think from the time I was 2 years old, my parents started noticing me like wheezing and coughing. And my dad knew from his experiences with asthma that I likely had asthma. So they took me to the doctor and I was diagnosed with asthma. And, I was put on inhalers and nebulizers and things like that. And so from then, as I grew up, I had a lot of inflammatory conditions. I had irritable bowel syndrome. I used to break out into chronic hives all over my body. I didn't know why. I used to have terrible allergies, all kinds of inflammatory things. And I ultimately ended up with the autoimmune disease, type 1 diabetes, where my body attacked the cells in my pancreas that make insulin. And so now I no longer make insulin. I do think that if I had known then, when I was 9 years old, what I know now, that I could have reversed that process if I caught it soon enough and allowed my cells to replenish themselves and heal and lower that inflammation. But needless to say, I didn't know that information. And so I no longer make insulin, and I'm type 1 diabetic. And so in all that, my parents and I were very reliant on Western medicine to help me manage those conditions, those things that I had. And they were very helpful. And I'm thankful for all that they did. However, as I grew up, and especially when I was in college, I started getting interested in health, and I started to notice that the way that I lived my life had a direct impact on my ability to manage these conditions, especially type 1 diabetes, but also the inflammation and things like that. And I thought that it was weird that no doctor had ever told me that I would basically go to the doctor and they would, do tests or whatever and get up to date on me. And then they would either change my medications, whether it was insulin or the drugs that I was on for inflammation and things, or they would add new drugs or things like that, or they'd do a new test. And I thought that it was very weird that I'd never heard from them that if I changed what I ate or the way I lived my life or exposure to toxins or things like that would have an impact on my health and on my ability to control these conditions that I had. And so, I kept getting more and more information. This obviously piqued my interest. And so I got really into a healthy lifestyle. In college, I majored in health and wellness. And I really started to figure out that, I could do things that completely manage these conditions. And I'm happy to say that, throughout all my trial and error and all the learning that I've done through college and my medical education and my master's degree and all the independent research I've done, that I have completely gotten rid of all the conditions that I had aside from type 1 diabetes, which I manage with a very low carbohydrate diet. Type 1 is kind of the collateral damage that happened from all that in my inflamed youth. And, unless there's a stem cell cure or something like that, I'll be stuck with that. But it's very well managed with a low carbohydrate diet. But even as well managed as it is, I remember going to the doctor's offices when I was a kid and seeing all the educational posters and everything that, would tell me that, as a type 1 diabetic, I am, predisposed to all these vascular conditions, whether it's heart disease or amputations or decreases in eye health, all these different types of things, or neuropathy, that kind of stuff. And so I asked doctors why that was, and they said it was vascular damage that would happen because of high blood sugars, because, really no matter how hard I try, my blood sugars will be higher than normal persons, although they're getting pretty close with, different insulin pumps and different continuous glucose monitors to make them pretty non-diabetic. And so I've done everything I can to look into how to prevent this vascular damage or heart disease in general, cardiovascular ailments. And so much of my independent research, and every time I heard something about, heart disease or anything like that during my medical education or anywhere, my ears perked up and I would soak that in, And so I've amassed this, large body of knowledge about cardiovascular disease. And what I found was pretty surprising. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about heart health. And I think the real path to heart health and some of the confusion that we've had on heart health, and really get to the bottom of things.
I've been pretty vocal about my choice to stop using ButcherBox and switch to Belcampo, and these sorts of bold statements get me into conflict, but it's totally worth it. I take my job really seriously, and I never want to recommend something that's lost its luster and has you purchasing and trusting in the wrong thing. So Belcampo has their meats independently tested for purity and nutritional data, and on a quarterly basis, they post the results directly on their website so you can check it out. This quarter's results are in, and they are astounding. Belcampo grass-fed beef averages a 1 to 1.2 omega-3 to 6 ratio, while conventional beef has an omega-3 to 6 ratio of a 1 to 30. 30 of omega-6. And not all 100% grass-fed beef is created equally. They've tested beef from others with the grass-fed quote-unquote label and found ratios averaging 1 to 12 of omega-3 to 6. Now, this just tells us how inflammatory these meats are. The lower the omega-6, the better. So Belcampo's grass-fed beef averaging 1 to 1.2 omega-3 to 6 ratio is incredible. Their beef has the same ratio of omega-3 to 6 as wild game meat. This is totally rare in the business where brands slap on the grass-fed label and don't stand behind the quality, but they sure charge you for it. Belcampo pasture-raised pork has 25 times the amount of omega-3s of conventional pork and a ratio of 2 to 1 of saturated to unsaturated fat. Belcampo's pasture-raised chicken has 20% higher protein per serving. The list goes on and on and on and on. I'm so thankful for Belcampo, their true commitment to quality, and for the 20% discount they've offered to all of us so that we can give them a try and fall in love with them. Just like I have. Oh my word. Get 20% off with the code KDP on your first purchase, excluding sale items, over at belcampo.com/KDP. Again, that's code KDP for 20% off when you go to belcampo.com/KDP.
So I think the first thing we should talk about is cholesterol. Cholesterol is something that tends to dominate the conversation about heart disease. And as you're going to find out, I don't think it's as important of a marker to be looking at, or not the only important marker we should be looking at when it comes to heart disease. But yet, Western medicine tends to have this very myopic view of heart disease as caused by this high LDL number and high cholesterol, and eating cholesterol is bad and all this stuff, which could be problematic on a ketogenic diet because, we tend to eat more fat. And that's what we've been told is causative in heart disease. And so where did this all start? This all started with Ancel Keys who was a scientist who in the 1950s came out with a study, or I guess more of a report, I guess, where he looked at, he basically looked at, he took surveys of the amount of animal fat or saturated fat and cholesterol that people ate in different countries, and then looked at the rates of heart disease in that country. And he lined it up on a graph and showed that the countries that ate more saturated fat had more heart disease. And so the funny thing is, though, is that he kind of cherry picked the data, because there was data from 22 countries available at the time, and he picked the 6 that showed him the correlation that he wanted to see. And then he later did it in another study with 7 countries. He added 1 more country, but there was 22 data from 22 countries available. And the funny thing is that maybe a few years later, maybe it was 1959 or something like that, 2 statisticians, a scientist from UC Berkeley and a New York City, a statistician that worked for the New York State, redid the experiment and included the data from all 22 countries and found no correlation between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. But the other problem with this is that this type of science is called epidemiology. And this is really important because today we're bombarded with a bunch of media headlines that say so-and-so or whatever is associated with heart disease or associated with cancer or things like that. And when you see the word associated, then we're talking about an epidemiological study. And the problem with epidemiology is that it's the lowest rung of research that we can do. It's the bottom tier, which means it's not very good research. And so the only thing we can find with a epidemiological study is association, but we cannot say that there was any cause. We don't know what the cause was. We can just see that there's an association. So the example I like to give is you can say that, let's say you're sitting in a traffic jam and it's cloudy outside. You can say that traffic jam is associated with cloudiness because they're occurring at the same time, but you can't say that the cloudiness is causing the traffic jam or the traffic jam is causing the cloudiness. You just can't say that. And so that's exactly what happened, though, is that with these epidemiological studies, the government and academic institutions took them and they made recommendations based on those. They found, or they claimed that, especially Ansel Keys claimed that this association was proving that saturated fat causes heart disease, causes atherosclerosis and heart disease. And what really should be done is epidemiological studies we should say, oh, that's interesting. There's an association there. Now let's design a clinical trial to see if, in fact, that association is a causal relationship where one causes the other. And that just doesn't happen. But there are many other flaws with epidemiology studies as well. Flaws in that it's based on surveys. So you're asking people to remember what they ate a long time ago, which I could tell you what I ate 3-4 months ago because I eat the same thing all the time. But most people probably couldn't tell you they don't remember what they ate or how much of what they ate. And so that's a problem. But also there's what's called healthy user bias. So lots of times people who have been following the dietary recommendations from the government and academic institutions for the last 40, 50 years have been told that meat is bad, saturated fat is bad. So they're eating less of it. And those are people who are very health conscious. They're trying to be healthy. They're trying to follow those recommendations. And so they're also doing things like exercising and reducing their stress and not smoking and not drinking and not exposing themselves to toxins because they care about these things. And so can we say that the associational benefit that we see is from them not eating meat and saturated fat, or is it from all the other healthy behaviors they did? And then vice versa. What if we look at people who didn't care about their health or just weren't interested in their health? And so, they didn't pay attention to the recommendation to not eat saturated fat or not eat meat, and they ate a ton of it. But they also did other unhealthy behaviors because they didn't really care about their health. So they smoked and drank and didn't exercise and were sedentary and all these different things. So was it the meat and saturated fat they were eating, or was it the poor diet overall that they had and all the other unhealthy behaviors that they did? And so that's a really big problem with epidemiology, is that there's so many variable factors and we can't prove one thing or the other. So just know that when you look out in the headlines, especially headlines for ketogenic diets or high-fat diets or research on high-fat or animal products or things like that, just know that if you see the word association, even if you don't see the word association, if you see linked or anything like that, then that's an epidemiological study and we can't really draw conclusions from that. So that's how it all started. But then taking a step back and looking at things from an evolutionary perspective, cholesterol is a molecule that evolution preserved for millions of years, from the time that we first became human and even before that, before humans first came around. And so if if cholesterol was this evil thing that was causing this disease, back when natural selection was really taking place, it would have removed that. I mean, people or even animals before us who had high cholesterol that was so damaging to us, they would have been selected out. They would have died sooner, and that trait would have been selected out. Yet cholesterol was preserved, and so it's very essential for life. And just thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective is very interesting. But then we look at the modern science, we see that cholesterol is necessary for many, many different things. I mean, it's very necessary for assisting our body in defense from infection. It's key for cellular repair. It's key for decreasing inflammation in the body. It's key for the health of like our cellular receptors, so our body can receive, or our cells can receive things and take them in. Cholesterol is the backbone for all of our hormones, including our sex hormones. It helps us make vitamin D. It carries around the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, which are essential for health. We don't have fat-soluble vitamins, we're in trouble. It's essential for delivering energy. So if we want to have good energy, we need cholesterol to do that. It plays a role in muscle function, and it actually prevents vascular calcification, which is interesting because that's what it's been blamed on doing. And so, it actually, it helps with the conversion of vitamin K1 to K2. And that helps prevent atherosclerosis because it helps deposit minerals where they need to go. Instead of in the artery, they go into the bone where they're supposed to go. So cholesterol has all these amazing benefits. And so if we think about it, cholesterol, which we're going to talk about atherosclerosis here in a minute and how cholesterol is not the culprit. But if cholesterol is not the culprit and it has all these benefits, then lowering it with a statin drug or with a cholesterol lowering medication, now there's these newer ones called PCSK9 inhibitors, that can be problematic because we're taking away all the benefits that this LDL has for us. And just a few, kind of anecdotal things, personally, when I went on a ketogenic diet, my cholesterol went up, and I was a little freaked out about that because at the time I didn't know what I know now. And then when I went on a carnivore diet, which I've been doing for a little while now, it went way up. My cholesterol went way up. And so some of the benefits that I noticed from that actually are, one, that when I first went on a heavy ketogenic diet, I used to get sick often, and now I don't. And even if I do, I'll correct that. I'll say I do get sick because I can feel it. I can feel like in the back of my throat, or I can feel like in my nose. Like I do get these symptoms of kind of a cold, but it never develops into anything. I never have uncontrollable sneezing or coughing. I never develops into a full cold. I just kind of, for a day or two, I get these little tiny symptoms, and I can tell that there's something in there. But the high cholesterol that I have is really taking care of that infection because it's binding the bacteria so that they can't take a hold of me. And that's just one advantage from having high cholesterol. But the other advantage is that as a type 1 diabetic, I'm very sensitive to the insulin that I take. I can really tell how my body's reacting to insulin. And when my cholesterol went up, I noticed a definite increased sensitivity to the insulin I was taking. I had to take less, or my body was just more responsive to it. And so that's because the insulin receptor, there's a molecule that's made from cholesterol called dolicol, and it's really important for the insulin receptors to function. So those are just two benefits that I noticed from having higher cholesterol. So then we have to look at things though, because most of the time a cardiologist is going to tell you, no, LDL needs to be down. We don't want it to be high. But there's these clear advantages. And so I think that we need to look at things like, people with genetically low cholesterol, people with A-beta lipoproteinemia, they tend to have problems with recurrent infections. They tend to have problems with walking, like ataxia, because the cholesterol can't nourish their nerves. They tend to have blindness because they can't deliver vitamin A to the eyes because there's no cholesterol. And they tend to die earlier, like in their 4th or 5th generations. And so then conversely, people would say, okay, yeah, so LDL has all these benefits, but it's still problematic when it becomes high. It has a role in the body, but when it gets too high, that's a problem. And so then we can look at people with familial hypercholesterolemia, where they had genetically very high cholesterol. And in those people, we actually see interesting things. There was a study done where they looked at they looked back through history of a family that had genetic traits of familial hypercholesterolemia, and they looked at over 2 centuries, 200 years, and they traced this family. And they found that these people didn't die any sooner than people with quote unquote normal cholesterol. And they found that they tended to have an advantage in times where infection was running around. These people tend to have resistance to infection. So very interesting stuff there. So, and I've also had many people reach out to me and say they have familiar hypercholesterolemia and their calcium or their coronary artery calcium score is 0. So they have this high cholesterol, genetically very high cholesterol, and they have no atherosclerosis in their coronary arteries. So LDL is not the cause here. But what do we want to look for on a blood panel then? And so if you get your lipid panel, I think that's a very myopic view. And we're going to talk about the markers that I think are better to track. But if you get a lipid panel, what you want to see is that if your LDL is high, that's okay, as long as your HDL is also high within the normal to high range, as long as your triglycerides are low, under 100, and as long as you have low markers of inflammation. And so some markers of inflammation would be like high sensitivity C-reactive protein or myeloperoxidase, or you could look at insulin resistance. So you could look at your fasting insulin and your fasting blood sugar and calculate your HOMA-IR score. And those are all blood markers that we want to be looking at, because we can't just look at the blood panel, the cholesterol panel in general, and say this is good or bad. We have to look at the blood panel as a whole. And so if there's lots of inflammation in the body, then LDL could become problematic. It's still not the cause of atherosclerosis. The inflammation is the cause. But we want that blood panel to look like that. Luckily, a ketogenic diet is very likely to do those things. It's very likely to decrease inflammation long term, and as well, it's also going to increase HDL, decrease triglycerides. Just restricting carbohydrates in general is what tends to do this, and so that's the ideal kind of blood panel we want to look at. So there's a number of people that their cholesterol goes way up on a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet or something like that, and I want to be the first one to say that that's not a problem as long as other things look okay. So that's what we have to work toward. We have to be knowledgeable about that.
I really hope you're enjoying today's episode. I'd love to see where you're listening from. You can snap a pic and tag me at Leanne Vogel, or leave a review for the show on your favorite podcast player. It helps me out tremendously. Okay, back to the good stuff.
So let's move on. So if cholesterol is not causing atherosclerosis, then what is causing atherosclerosis? What is causing the hardening of arteries that we're seeing across the population? And first we have to talk about the artery itself. And so the artery has these layers. And so there's the subendothelial space, which is the layer beneath the cells that line the artery. Then there's the cells that line the artery called the endothelium. Then there's a glycocalyx, which is kind of like this fiber-like, kind of like a shag carpet that lines the artery a little bit and protects the lining of the artery. And then there's a very little known layer on top of that that's actually formed by water. And so there's this new science is coming into the mainstream a little bit that's showing that when the water in our blood, because our blood is almost half water, is energized enough, it starts to form this layer of what's called exclusion zone water next to the lining of the artery, right on top of the glycocalyx. And the reason that it's called exclusion zone water is because the way that it forms, it kind of splits the water molecule up and then combines in a different way. The way that it forms, it excludes everything that's not it. So if there's this layer of this exclusion zone water lining the artery around the whole circumference of the artery, then the contents of the blood, no matter what's in it, will never touch the lining of the artery because it excludes everything. It keeps it. And so Dr. Gerald Pollack has done the most research on this. And in his book, he says that the protein albumin was excreted, meaning it couldn't, or excluded. It couldn't come in contact with anything that was on the other side of the exclusion zone water that formed. And the curious thing about that is that the protein albumin is one of the smallest molecules in the blood. And an LDL molecule, even a damaged one like lipoprotein a, is way bigger than protein albumin. So if albumin can't get in there, then these LDL molecules aren't going to touch the lining of the artery if we have that intact exclusion zone surface that's lining the artery. So then we have to ask ourselves, well, how does atherosclerosis form if this water is there? Well, there's things that can break down that water, and it turns out to be the same things that we see when we look at things that cause atherosclerosis, like excess inflammation in the body. And so because of the way the exclusion zone water forms, it's a very negatively charged area. The whole area of it just has a net negative charge. And so things that are looking for electrons, which are negatively charged, and looking to steal electrons from that area will break down the exclusion zone water. And so those are things called free radicals. So people may have heard of this thing called oxidative stress, where we get a buildup of free radicals in our body, and that can cause inflammation in the body. So these things, when they're floating around in the blood, they can steal electrons from that exclusion zone water and break it down. And then the things that were causing the breakdown of exclusion zone water will now end up having contact with the glycocalyx and then endothelium, and then we get damage. We get damage to the endothelium. We get damage to the lining of the artery. And that damage is what's causing atherosclerosis, because in response to that damage, the body says, okay, we have to do something. We have to repair that. And so it takes whatever it can to make kind of like this spackle, and it repairs that artery so that it's hard, so that we don't get a ruptured artery, which would be a problem. And so it takes cholesterol and calcium and various other minerals. They've even found oxalate, which is a plant toxin, in the lining of arteries. So it takes these things so that it can build this hard surface so that we don't get a ruptured artery. So that's what we're measuring when we're measuring a coronary artery calcium scan. We're measuring the amount of calcium that's been deposited in there so that it can not rupture. And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, where are we getting all these free radicals? Well, the interesting thing is that on a ketogenic diet, it's been shown in multiple tissues of the body that being in ketosis and burning fatty acids and ketones for fuel will result in less free radical production, less oxidative stress. So being on a ketogenic diet, we're producing less of those molecules that will break down our exclusion zone water. The other interesting thing is that things like heavy metals, like mercury and cadmium, and things like that have been shown to, when they're present in the body in high amounts, we get increased atherosclerosis. And I think that's no coincidence, because those metals, which our body has no physiologic need for, they act like free radicals in the body. And so they can damage the lining of the exclusion zone water and then the endothelia, because they're toxins. And so that's why smoking has been increased, or has been shown to increase rates of atherosclerosis, because it's very high in toxins. You're putting those toxins in your body, and they're causing free radical damage to the lining of the artery, and then we have to repair it. And so there's many different toxins we could be exposed to, but those are the main things there. Even internal toxins, like toxins from endotoxemia. So if we have leaky gut, bacteria from our gut could be leaking into the bloodstream, and those bacteria are not supposed to be there, and that's called endotoxemia. And those have been shown to increase atherosclerosis. So there's lots of different things. So the real cause of atherosclerosis is inflammation from eating processed carbohydrate-rich foods that were, causing inflammation, but also creating more free radicals in the process of burning them, and also toxin exposure. Those are the main two, I think, that are driving this disease. And that cholesterol has kind of been framed in this process because it was found at the scene of the crime as the repair mechanism, and it kind of got blamed. So that's the thing with cholesterol. So as long as, again, I'll reiterate, as long as if your cholesterol is high, that's okay, as long as other markers of inflammation are low, and as long as we have good triglyceride numbers and good HDL numbers. That's kind of the what we want to look for to know if we're being protected against atherosclerosis.
Keto flu, impossible fasting symptoms that stop you mid-fast, cravings at any hour of the day, or feeling off after a sweaty workout. These are some of the signs that you're low in electrolytes. When I first started keto, I made all of the mistakes. One of the biggest ones was not supplementing with electrolytes. And still, 7 years into keto, I often forget how essential electrolytes are. Honestly, it's easy to forget to take electrolytes because, well, a lot of them don't taste very good or work very well. Enter Element, the most delicious, well-balanced electrolyte powder I've personally tried, like ever. Add to water and enjoy any time of day. These electrolytes are salty, as they should be, quenching your thirst and hitting the spot. And the best part, when you head to drinklmnt.com/KDP, you'll receive a free Element Sample Pack. You only pay $5 for shipping. The sample pack includes 8 packets of Element. That includes 2 citrus, 2 raspberry, 2 orange, and 2 raw unflavored. Go to drinklmnt.com/KDP for your free sample pack. I love Element, and I really think you're going to too. Again, that's drinkelement.com/KDP to get your free sample pack. And if you don't love it, they will refund your $5, no questions asked.
Now, the next thing really blew my mind when I came across it, but the next thing is that there's this notion that atherosclerosis and buildup of plaque in the arteries will get so extensive, especially in the heart arteries, will get so extensive that it blocks an artery, and that restricts oxygen to the heart, and the heart then gets damaged. It gets ischemia or tissue death because there's no oxygen to that tissue. And that's the thought there. So, if we want to protect ourselves from atherosclerosis and that kind of thing happening, then obviously we want to be on a low carbohydrate diet and avoid toxins the best we can. However, there's some really interesting research by an Italian guy named Giorgio Beraldi, who did a lot of his research, from like the 1950s until the early 2000s when he died. And he did a lot of interesting things. So one thing that he found was that, he did these plastic cast studies. So he would take the hearts of people who died of heart attacks or didn't die of heart attacks or just died of an accident or whatever, and he would do autopsies, and he would take the heart and he would put a latex or neoprene solution he would pump it into the arterial system of the heart, and then he would take hydrochloric acid, or he'd wait for that neoprene or latex to harden or dry and harden, and then he would take a hydrochloric acid solution and he would dissolve away the tissue around it. And what he was left with was a perfect cast of the arterial system of the heart. And I've seen this done like if you go to the Body World exhibits or the Animals Inside Out exhibits that travel around, they do this with the different animals or different organs and things like that. So this is what he did. And some curious things that he found was that anywhere that there was a more than 75 or more than 70% blockage, like atherosclerosis buildup and blockage of an artery in the heart, that the body had built a collateral system of arteries that went around it and totally bypassed it. And he said anywhere from 16 to 30 different arteries that went around it. They were smaller and you can't really see them on an angiogram because they're just not that big. But there was so many of them that they completely bypassed the blockage. And then I found some other research that shows that these arteries can form within 4 days. I found one that said they can form within 7 days, and I found another article that says they can form within 4 days. So they gradually produced a blockage in an artery in an animal, and the body built this collateral network of arteries in 4 days. So to me, that tells me that the only and that's the thing, is that Beraldi found this in every single case where there was more than 70% blockage. He found this collateral system of arteries. So what that tells me is that maybe the atherosclerosis buildup causing a blockage doesn't necessarily drive heart attacks or the mechanism behind heart attacks. Now, there are still heart attacks that can definitely happen from, say, like a clot formation, that we get damage to the lining of an artery, a clot forms, and that flows down to a smaller blood vessel and temporarily blocks the blood flow, and we get ischemia that way. That can definitely happen. But I think that there's this whole other mechanism of how heart attacks can happen if we have this bypass of collateral systems. And so I started really looking into it and trying to figure out what that was. And the other interesting thing that Beraldi found is that when he did these autopsies, he found that there were people that, died of a heart attack that had no blockage present. And, cardiologists have told me that that's because the blockage was dissolved away before they did the autopsy. Or he found that, say, this person had a heart attack and there was atherosclerotic buildup in one area of the heart or in one artery of the heart, but the heart attack happened in a completely different area of the heart. So there's all these confusing findings that he found. And so when I look at what I think causes a heart attack, I think it causes some heart attacks. I think that there's 3 imbalances in the body that can drive this. One of them is not being very well fat adapted, not being well adapted to burning fat for fuel. Another is high oxidative stress, which we talked about, and high free radical from getting toxin exposure and not burning fat for fuel. And the third one is an autonomic nervous system imbalance. So your autonomic nervous system is basically the system in your body that interprets your environment and tells your body if it's in a safe or threatening environment. And the problem is that we can get an imbalance, and that our body can be interpreting that we're in a threatening environment more often than it should be. And that can happen from modern day stresses that we're not really evolved to handle. And so, if we look at our modern life, there's something to do all the time. There's all these notifications on our phone. We can get stressed out in traffic. We can be worried about our kids, our jobs, our schooling, whatever. And there's just constant stressors in our life that make our life very difficult, and that can create an imbalance in our autonomic nervous system. And when that happens, we get stuck in what's called the sympathetic state, and our bodies, we get improper signaling to the organs of our body, because our body is interpreting, like our senses are interpreting the environment around us, saying if we're in a safe or threatening environment. The brain interprets that and then sends out the correct signal to the organs. So do we need to get away from a threat, or do we need to rest and digest and do that kind of stuff? So an imbalance in our autonomic nervous system is that third imbalance there. So I want to string those three things together, not being fat adapted, oxidative stress, and the imbalance in our autonomic nervous system. I want to string those together and explain what causes a heart attack in those cases where there's no blockage. And so what happens is that the heart is a very special organ, because it, unlike the rest of the body, it has been shown in research that the heart prefers to burn fatty acids and ketones. So in most of the body, when glucose is present, your body will burn the glucose first. That's kind of like the oxidative priority, the burning of energy priority for it. It'll burn the glucose. That's why we have to restrict carbohydrates for our body to burn fat, to get into ketosis. But the heart, even in the presence of glucose, if you put ketones there, it will burn those first, which is very interesting. And so I think that plays a huge role, because I think that when the heart is forced to burn more carbohydrate or more glucose than it wants to, that's when bad things happen. And you'll see what I mean here in a minute. The other thing is that oxidative stress has been shown to decrease nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is a molecule that's made in the lining of our arteries, and it's really important for that proper signaling of the autonomic nervous system to our heart. And so if we have atherosclerosis, then the lining of our arteries can't really make enough nitric oxide. And also, if we have high oxidative stress, then nitric oxide can be used to neutralize some of those free radicals that are floating around. So that depletes nitric oxide as well. So if we don't have enough nitric oxide, we can't get proper signaling to the heart cells. So what happens here is that if we have these two preconceived things, where we have high oxidative stress, and we're also not well fat adapted, so our heart's probably having to burn more glucose than it wants to, then we can, in the I guess the setting of those two imbalances, we can also be very stressed. And if we have a major stressful event that happens, which we know that heart attacks, there's been studies that show that heart attacks happen during more stressful days of the year. And so Mondays was a big one. They noticed a huge correlation with heart attacks on Mondays. And so what happens is we have these preconceived imbalances, and then we have a stressful event that happens. And when that stressful event happens, usually what should happen is that our heart should send the stress signal to the organs of the body, to the heart. And what should happen is we should get that stress response of the heart, but we should also get a lesser kind of balancing non-stress response. That's how it's normally supposed to happen, to keep the two systems balanced. We don't want too much of a stress response. But the problem is that nitric oxide is essential for that non-stress signal to be sent to the heart cells. It can't get into the cell and send the signal without nitric oxide. So if we depleted nitric oxide from atherosclerosis or from too many free radicals in the body, then if we get that stress signal and we don't get the balancing, like the lesser non-stress signal with it, it's supposed to happen, then our heart gets this full stress signal. And so when we get that full stress signal, the body, when we're in a stressful situation, it mobilizes things to get us away from a threat. So we need to run away or fight it off or anything like that. And so when that happens, just like if you go for a run, your body gets your muscles get a stress signal and they start burning glucose, the stored glycogen in the muscles. And when you start burning glucose in those muscles, you start to get a buildup of lactic acid and hydrogen ions. And that's the muscle burn you feel when you go for a run. And the thing is that when you go for a run, you can just stop running if the muscle gets to hurting too much. But if this happens in the heart, if we get the stress signal without the balanced non-stress signal, then the heart can all of a sudden switch into burning more glucose than it wants to. And we can't just stop the heart from pumping. And so what happens is that we get a buildup of lactic acid and hydrogen ions, which creates a burning sensation in the chest, which is what we would call angina. And then two things happen. One, that buildup of lactic acid causes swelling in the tissue, and it interferes with calcium getting absorbed into the cells. Calcium is how the muscles contract. So then if we're interfering with heart muscle contraction, that's a problem. And then also it creates a swelling, and we've seen this in skeletal muscle too, but in the cardiac muscle, we get this increase of lactic acid and hydrogen ions, we get a swelling of the heart tissue. And when that happens, usually the pressure is more coming from the arteries into the cells, into the tissues, so that the blood can get in there. But when we get this swelling, the pressure changes. The swelling gets to be too much. Now the blood can't get in because the pressure is more going out. And so then the blood cannot get to the area of the heart where it's affecting, where it's having this the stress signal. And when blood can't get in there, the muscles can't contract because there's no calcium. We get tissue death. And so this whole cascade of events happens because of these imbalances, because we're not well fat adapted. Because if we have a stress response in the heart and we're not well fat adapted, it's just more likely to go into burning glucose for fuel. We deplete nitric oxide with atherosclerosis and with high toxins in the body. And then we get this imbalanced stress response. And that can trigger the whole series of events if these other two imbalances are in place. So that's kind of what I've come across that explains to me how we could get a heart attack without a blockage, and why there's this large percentage where we don't find a blockage. And so that begs the question of how do we make sure these things, these imbalances aren't happening? As well as, a lipid panel and those inflammatory markers we were talking about before. That is one thing we need to be tracking for our heart health or for our status of heart health. But the other things I think are we in ketosis? Or do we have the ability to readily get in ketosis, even if you break it by eating carbs sometimes? Do we have the ability to get into ketosis easily? So that would be tracking ketones, whether it's through urine or breath or blood. Blood's probably the most accurate. But tracking that you're in ketosis so that you're making ketones and burning them. The next thing we should be tracking is oxidative stress. We could track nitric oxide directly in a blood test, testing for nitric oxide. We could also test for asymmetrical dimethylarginine or asymmetrical dimethylarginine, which are markers of the arginine molecule in the production of nitric oxide in the endothelial cells, which is very important. But we also want to be tracking markers of oxidative stress in our body and inflammation in general in our body. So I mentioned that we want to be tracking, the inflammation like high sensitivity C-reactive protein or myeloperoxidase, things like that. But I also think we should be tracking markers of oxidative stress directly. So we could look at damage to fats in the body, like looking at lipid peroxides. We could look at 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, which is a marker of DNA damage from oxidative stress. We could be looking at GGT, which is an enzyme in the liver that would be elevated if we had oxidative stress. So all those types of things are very important to be looking at as well. And if you want like a full list of what I think people should be tracking, I've written about this in my blog at resourceyourhealth.com. So you can go there and check that out. But then the last thing we should be looking at is this balance in our autonomic nervous system. I think that's very, very important. And I think it's driving not just heart attacks, but chronic disease in general. And so the best marker that we know of to track for balance in our autonomic nervous system is heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is basically like if you were to take your pulse right now and you were to take a deep breath in, you would feel your pulse quicken. And then as you breathe out slowly, you'll notice that your pulse slows down. And so the difference between the fastest that it gets when you take a breath in and the slowest it gets when you take a breath out is your heart rate variability. And so basically this is measuring your ability to adapt. So if you have a very narrow heart rate variability where it's not much difference, then you're kind of stuck in one state. You're kind of stuck in the middle. You can't go from one stress state to non-stress state. You can't go to the extremes. And so what we want is a high heart rate variability. And the way we can track that is there's lots of different devices out there that you can wear on your wrist, or there's rings, or there's devices you can just put your finger in and it'll test it at that moment in time. But there's lots of different devices you can use to track heart rate variability. And so those I think are the big ones we need to be tracking. Are we in ketosis, or do we have the ability to readily get in ketosis? do we have high oxidative stress, and looking at blood markers of that, and then also our heart rate variability. Those are the big ones, I think, that we need to be tracking for heart health, but especially as risk for heart attack. And so this myopic view of looking at cholesterol and LDL and saying that, yes, this is going to determine whether you're going to have a heart attack or not, I think is very short-sighted. And we need to be looking at the whole picture here. The last subject I want to talk about is heart failure. So we talked about heart attacks. We talked about atherosclerosis. The other component of heart disease is heart failure. And so I don't have much time to get into all the mechanics of heart failure, but basically when you look at the heart and the form and what it does, the heart is not really a true pressure propulsion pump like we're taught. It's not the thing that's pumping the blood forcefully around the body. And so there's lots of evidence out there to suggest this. And there was one doctor named Brenko First who wrote a whole book, 200-page book, basically read like a 200-page research article with all the evidence showing that the heart is not this true pressure propulsion pump. It does provide some flow for the blood, but the true role of the heart is it's a vortex, so it swirls the blood, and there's a reason that it does that. And so remember when we were talking about the exclusion zone layer of the arteries and how that forms and how that protects the arteries? Well, it also does something else. It also creates an energy gradient that actually drives blood flow. And this has been proven in the lab of Dr. Gerald Pollack. And so when we have this intact exclusion zone water, it actually drives blood flow by moving water and then whatever's in the contents of that water, which is all the blood and the metabolites in the blood, it drives blood flow so that the heart doesn't have to be the sole pumper of the blood. And there's lots of things that can help energize the water in our blood. And that could be things like infrared sauna, or sunlight is the natural way to get infrared light. It could be contact with the earth and absorbing electrons and energy from the earth. It could be human touch. It could be swirling or vortexing. And if you look at the heart and the way it's designed and the way it's oriented, when it contracts, it swirls the blood, and swirling it in the presence of oxygen, which I think there's no mistake that there's no coincidence that the lungs and the heart are so close to each other, and the blood goes back and forth between the two. Because when you swirl blood or water in the presence of oxygen, it energizes it. And so what causes heart failure then? Heart failure is caused, I think, when the heart is forced to pump the blood more than it's designed to do. Because it's not this pressure propulsion pump that's causing all the blood flow. We have these other mechanisms like the exclusion zone water, also the movement of our muscles, also the pressure gradient between our lungs and pressure that it creates. Lots of different ways that the blood moves. And so if we don't have this energized, if the water in our blood is not energized enough and the heart is forced to do more pumping than it's designed to do, then what we get is we get this expanding of the heart muscle because it's having to create so much force and pressure that it's not designed to do. And that's exactly what we see in heart failure. The heart loses its shape of this football-like looking thing, and it becomes more of this basketball type thing. And so and then we also see that people with heart failure get, fluid retention. They get swelling of their tissues. And that makes sense because if the heart's is forced to have to do more pumping than it's designed to, then it also means that the fluid in the body and the blood is not moving either. So it's pooling up in areas of the body. So we really misunderstood heart failure too, because we misunderstood the heart as a whole. And these are things that I've written about a lot on my blog. And so the other aspect of this is that in heart failure, people are told to not take salt or not eat salt because that will create more fluid retention. But there's absolutely no evidence behind that. And there's plenty of systematic review articles that show that there's absolutely no evidence behind that. And there's even one article that showed that they were giving heart failure patients a diuretic, and then they compared that with giving them a diuretic and saline solution. And the people who got the saline solution as well as the diuretic, they had less return for hospitalizations for heart failure. They had increased heart function. They had better quality of life. And it makes sense too, because if you're not taking in any minerals in the form of salt, your body's going to want to hold on to as many minerals as it can because you're not intaking any. And the way that it holds on minerals is it retains fluid because minerals have to be dissolved in fluid. So it's retaining all this because you don't have enough minerals. Whereas we give the body minerals in the form of salt, now it can afford to waste some of that fluid because it's got enough minerals to replace it. So that that results in the better outcomes for these heart failure patients. So going back to like a ketogenic diet, the really interesting thing about heart failure is that there's plenty of studies, just a ton of them, that show that the preferred fuel source for the failing heart, people in heart failure, is ketones. And to me, this makes sense because the heart is having to do more work than it wants to. Its preferred fuel source is ketones. So why would it not want those preferably in heart failure when it's having to do the most work? It needs the most efficient fuel, and that is ketones. So another argument for a ketogenic diet for people with heart failure. But also it makes sense too, because one of the things about ketogenic diets is that we need to make sure we're replacing our electrolytes and getting enough mineral salt, like real salt or sea salt or Himalayan salt, those types of things. And those are very, very important on ketogenic diets, and they're even more important for people with heart failure. I'm not saying that people in heart failure should just go and like take a ton of salt, but they shouldn't restrict it either, and know that it's actually going to help them. So that's kind of all that I found on the heart. So just to kind of wrap things up, I think that the ketogenic diet is the best thing that people can do for any type of heart disease, as long as they're also doing things that also reduce inflammation, like avoiding toxins and stuff. I think that we've completely misunderstood the heart and its function, its role, and the development of the diseases we associate with the heart. So I think that we need to take a big picture look at this and kind of reassess things, and hopefully you all gain some information from me that will help guide you in your quest to heart health, and what markers to track and what things to do. But I just want to leave off with a way you can find me. And so I'm active on social media. I post a lot about the heart on my Instagram and my Facebook and my Twitter. And so all my handles there are just at Dr. Stephen Hussey. That's Dr. Stephen Hussey. So you can find me there. I also have my blog at resourceyourhealth.com/blog, where I write a lot about the heart as well. And you can also email me directly if you're interested in coaching or any of the information that I've put out there. Please ask me questions. My email is Stephen, STEPHEN, at resourceyourhealth.com. You can find me there if you're interested in coaching or anything like that. It was an honor to be on, and I hope that everybody enjoyed it. Stay healthy out there.
Thanks for listening to the Keto Diet Podcast. Join us again in a couple of days to discover more Keto for Women secrets for your fat-fueled life. Music for the Keto Diet Podcast provided by Yechi. Follow Jacob on Instagram at Yechi_official and on Spotify as Yechi. That's YECHI. The Keto Diet Podcast, including show notes and links, provides information in respect to healthy living, recipes, nutrition, and diet, and is intended for informational purposes only. The information provided is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, nor is it to be construed as such. We cannot guarantee that the information provided on the Keto Diet Podcast reflects the most up-to-date medical research. Information is provided without any representations or warranties of any kind. Please consult a qualified physician for medical advice, and always seek the advice of a qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding your health and nutrition program.